Hello, welcome to my bookshelf, and today I want to give you my thoughts and feelings on Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire. And as you can probably tell from the title of this video, I have some very unpopular opinions about this book, so you can probably see where this is going. I'm sorry guys, I just didn't like this book. And like I said, I know that's an unpopular opinion, but I'm going to do my best here in this video to explain to you why I didn't like this book and why this fell through for me. So, as I'm sure you know, this book is set in a fantasy world in which certain kids are able to go through these doors into these fantastical worlds. Some are very logical, and some are very nonsensical, some are wicked, some are good, and there's a whole bunch of different unique stuff in between all that. Each fantasy world seems to the one that these kids go to seems to be like perfectly suited for them. It's almost like this is an expression of their personality, but within this like fantasy world. So I really love the premise of these fantasy worlds and this concept. Like, I think that is fantastic, and that is honestly the strongest point of this book. But the problem is that's not ultimately what this book is. So I'm about to do a mild spoiler here, but honestly, I'm not going to go into any details, but it's just really more about what genre this book really is. While there's fantasy elements to it, at the end of the day, mild spoiler here, this is a murder mystery, which I was not expecting going in at all. Every review that I've seen doesn't mention that, and honestly, the only complaint that I've heard of about this book is that it was just too short, but that they loved everything else. I do think that I agree with everyone saying that it is too short, and I do think that if it was longer, the author would have had more time to fix the problems I did end up having with this book. And one of them is the plot itself. This murder mystery plot is honestly very predictable. I figured out who it was pretty early on, and I would say I'm not really good at doing that normally, but it seemed very obvious. And because this book is so short, the pacing was unbelievably fast. Someone dies pretty early on, and then before you even have a chance to really process what happened, someone else dies. And again, I couldn't process what was happening. For a second, I thought I had misread. I thought they were talking about the first death, and then I realized this was a different person, and I was very confused at first. It all just happens very quickly. You really can't even mourn for each character. I can handle a book that has a pretty bland plot, but if that's the case, you're gonna need to have some fantastic characters that really pull this story through. The problem with this book is that not only is the plot bland, but the characters are kind of bland too, which I think a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, but please just hear me out. These characters are all very quirky, and their quirkiness is really just their dialogue though, which is problematic. We're told that these characters, like certain characters have been to nonsensical worlds, so they're very unusual and strange, and they're supposed to be this crazy, quirky person, and then you meet them, and yes, they have quirky dialogue, but literally everyone at this school seems to have quirky dialogue. They're all slightly different, but all quirky, right? They say things that people don't normally say. But because everyone is quirky, it kind of ruins how quirky each individual person is. It like dilutes the quirkiness. So I'm no longer shocked by what people are saying. I'm no longer really, it just seems normal. It just seems normal, and because of that, they seem bland, because they all seem too similar. There's only a couple of characters that really seem to have any unique personality traits, and even then, because this book is so short, it's only 170 pages, we really don't spend a lot of time with any characters, and so the little development we do get, it's still very limited, and it can't really fully hold the weight of this book on their shoulders. It just doesn't work. So for instance, our main character, Nancy, for being the character that we're following through this world, she has very little personality that's shown throughout the book. And I would argue that Jack gets more character development and more screen time, if you will, than Nancy, who we're actually following through the story. Jack has so much more personality, and just we see so much more from her than we do Nancy, that she actually feels like the star of the book. I'm not really sure if Nancy's supposed to be our main character or she's just a great way, because she's new to this school, right? So it makes sense that we're following her because we identify with her not knowing anything, you know? So that makes sense. But if we know nothing about Nancy, we know, you know, a lot more about these other characters, it feels weird. I'm not sure who the main character is. I guess in some senses this book is like an ensemble piece, which can work. But again, we need more screen time with the other characters as well. It doesn't work when it's all on one character and very little on all the others. Again, the little that we do know about these characters isn't shown to us. It's told to us, which again is a problem. Again, I think Jack is probably the only exception to these rules. We are told that she's basically a mad scientist, and she does fit into that stereotype very well, actually. She seems to have the most development, and I think as a reader we understand her a bit more, but all the other characters, they kind of have one trait, and that's about it. Our main character, Nancy, just seems to be very quiet, and the only other thing that we know about her, other than where she went for this fantasy world, is that she's asexual. And I know this is kind of a random thing to bring up. It threw me off when this was brought up. I mean, the first time was fine. I'm like, okay, it's unusual because you never see characters that are asexual. It's not something that's really brought up just in general, so it kind of threw me off that way. But I was like, okay, fine. It's just, you know, character development, right? Sure. But it was the only trait, if you will, that was ever brought up about Nancy, other than, you know, related to specifically the underworld that she went to. Her being asexual has nothing to do with who she is as a person, like what her personality is like. That doesn't tell me if she's a kind person, a mean person, stuck up, obnoxious, whatever. It tells me nothing about her personality traits. And again, in a book so short, when that's the only trait that you're telling me, I ultimately know nothing about her. I do see the purpose in that being brought up in the sense that it really demonstrates that her parents don't understand her. And that brings me to my next point. This book has a message of characters not being understood by their peers, by their friends, by their families. They're just not accepted by other people for whatever reason. They all have their unique, you know, reasons why. They're all different, right? They're all diverse. And that's part of why these characters specifically absolutely loved the world that they were thrown into, because they finally felt accepted there. They finally felt like they could be who they were inside. And they didn't have to hide themselves or anything like that. So they were just free to be themselves within these worlds. So that's why it's even more tragic and heartbreaking that they're in a reality that no longer accepts them, right? And this is a great message, right? I totally stand by this, you know. I get that. But the message is so heavy-handed to the point where it just bothered me. And I know that's probably not going to bother everyone, but it did for me personally. And I'm going to compare this to Christian fiction, which, you know, side note, I'm Christian, but I don't read Christian fiction because in my experience, it's so heavy-handed and so over the top that it turns me off to the message itself because it feels like it's being forced on me. And even though I agree overall with the message, I don't like how it's being presented to me. It's just distasteful to me personally. But more importantly, you know, the message aside, because again, I agree with the messages in both of these instances, but the bigger problem for me is that the plot and the characters suffer so much when your only focus seems to be on the overall message of your story. If the only thing that you care about as the author is what message am I going to get across to my readers, and you don't focus on the actual story that you're telling and the characters that are going through the story, the book just doesn't work. I mean, if you want to write a piece about whatever message it is you want to get across, then write that piece, but it doesn't need to be fiction. You're writing a fictional book here. Let's focus on the characters and the plot. And I think that if you focus on one or the other, I mean, it would be great if you focused on both, but if you focus on at least one of those things, the other things will fall into place. Your message will be clear. If you have to be so overt about your message, you're doing something wrong. There needs to be a little bit more nuance. I mean, it shouldn't be so nuanced that no one can understand what the message is or what the point is. So I just think the writing was kind of lazy in that. Everything was so explicit we're told that these characters are a certain way instead of the author just showing it to us. And again, if this book was longer, I honestly do believe that these problems would have been fixed. You know, we would have had more time with the characters, they would have had more time to react to situations so we could understand who they were better. But we didn't get that because the book was so short. And I felt no connection to the characters. I didn't really care about the characters that even died, which is horrible. Like, I didn't have enough time with them to know them, to care that they were no longer there. Ultimately, at the end of the day, this book just felt like a fantastic outline to a story. Plot points that the writer wants to include, and some character moments that are important to them. But, you know, we're gonna go back later and fill that in and really write the story and make it work. It didn't feel like a finished product to me. But, oh my goodness, there's so much potential here. Like I said, I really love the idea behind it. I love the concept. I personally would have been more interested in a story that actually was set in the fantasy worlds, and I do realize that the rest of the series does have some entries that are actually, in fact, in some of these fantasy worlds, so I might actually continue on to get a glimpse of that to see if that fixes some of my issues with the series. So ultimately, I actually gave this book 2 out of 5 stars. It was just okay to me, but it really was nothing special. Other than, of course, you know, the idea behind the book. I do think that the idea is fantastic and inspired, but let's make this into a better book than it is. I think the execution of this idea just didn't work for me. All right, so I realize I rambled on there a little bit, but I think I've made all my points pretty clear. Please let me know if I made any sense to you. Do you agree with me, at least on some level, even if you still like the book? I would love to know your thoughts and feelings on this. And like I said, there's so much potential here. I just wanted more. So please let me know what you think. And as always, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching this video. And until next time.